Further amendments?
I have one final amendment that I have. It's
Is it the final amendment or
it is
your
it
final
is
amendment?
my final amendment. It's number 52.
Gentlemen's,
Reserve point of order.
gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal, has an amendment at the desk. The gentlelady from Colorado reserves a point of order. The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This relates to an issue that we have dealt with just recently, and that is under the S-chip bill. Under current law, if an individual is allowed and permitted to come into this country as an immigrant, it has been the requirement that they agree as a condition that, first of all, they will have a sponsor, and secondly, that that sponsor will be responsible for them for a 5-year period, and that they will not immediately go on to our welfare or social service roles. This bill removes that 5-year requirement. Now, I know that you're going to say, well, we voted to do that last week in the S-chip bill, and it is true that it was done in the S-chip bill. But I would remind you that last week, the S-chip bill came to the floor of the House without coming through any committee, without any opportunity to amend it in a committee, and came to the floor with a closed rule with no opportunity to amend it on the floor. And therefore, if you voted for the S-chip expansion and this was a part, I'm sure you might be able to say to your constituents who ask you, why is it that you now want the American taxpayer in a time of recession to take on responsibility for people who said they wouldn't go on our welfare rolls for 5 years, and now you want to put them on there? Well, that was just a part of a larger S-chip bill. I'm going to give you the opportunity to vote on this as a freestanding issue with this amendment and make it clear to your constituents whether you do or don't agree that people who are allowed to come into this country should not be allowed to immediately go into the Medicaid rolls, and if you do agree that they should not be allowed to go immediately and should be required to be self-sufficient or to be covered by their sponsor, then I would hope that you would vote for the amendment.
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentlemen's
my time is up.
Time has expired. Chair will recognize Mr. Pallone.
Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, I will say what Mr. Deal said I was going to say, which is that we just voted on this in the S-chip bill, and the reason that we did is because it makes sense. I mean, people are here legally. We're only talking about legal immigrants now, under all different circumstances. Some have sponsors, some don't. You know, they can be here in a variety of situations. But the bottom line is it doesn't make sense for them to have to wait 5 years to have coverage. I mean, what does that mean? They don't have coverage, they delay care, they end up going to the emergency room, which costs us even more money, sometimes 10, 100 times what it would cost for them to be able to go to a doctor. It doesn't really make sense to say that if someone's here legally, that they should not be provided coverage, because it's just in the long run going to cost us more money. So I would ask that we oppose this, and I would yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our chair of our subcommittee for yielding to me. Mr. Deal is right that last week the S-chip bill passed, and it's a state option. That's just what this bill does. If the state doesn't want to do that, then they have that option. But there are states who may want to, and following up what Mr. Pallone said, that these folks just don't come into the country and get on S-chip for their children or Medicaid. These are folks who are laid off and have the option to take this if the state allows it. And again, like Mr. Pallone said, the children would, families would be waiting in the waiting room at an emergency room because they lost their insurance because of their employment. And again, it's a state option, and that's why I urge a no vote on the bill or the amendment.
Gentlemen,
Go ahead.
gentlemen, yield. Go ahead.
Otto was asking for time, or did I miss? No.
Mr. Gett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to point out it's especially ludicrous to talk about a 5-year exclusion when you talk about children, because if children had to wait for 5 years, then they wouldn't get the treatment they need at all. Thank you.
Same applies to a pregnant woman. 5-year wait for a pregnant woman makes no sense at all. It's stupid and it's morally wrong. Gentleman's time has expired. The vote now comes on this amendment. Mr. Deal, how do you want to proceed?
I'd like a recorded vote.
Okay, let's call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. No. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshoo. No. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak. No. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. No. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. No. Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette. No. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Harmon.
No.
Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky.
No.
Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez.
No.
Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Baldwin. I'm sorry, Ms. Baldwin. No. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Inslee. No. Mr. Inslee, no. Mr. Ross. No. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. No. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. No. Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. No. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Oh, there he is. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitt. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Shelley's.
Yeah, it's not going to cost me.
He's not here. Not here.
All members responded to the roll. Call the roll.
Mr. McNerney. No. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mrs. Capps.
Votes no.
Mrs. Capps votes no.
Clerk will tally the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the ayes were 11 and the nays were 31.
11 aye, 31 no. The amendment is not agreed to.